Vladislav II was never meant to rule two crowns. Born in 1461 as the eldest son of Casimir IV of Poland, Vladislav was a Jagiellonian prince, a member of one of Eastern Europe's most powerful dynasties. But it wasn't his father's realm in Poland that he would eventually inherit. Instead, the turn of events in the neighboring kingdom of Bohemia, following the death of King George of Podobrady in 1485, thrust Vladislav onto a throne riddled with factionalism, religious division, and foreign pressure. Bohemia in the late 15th century was not a kingdom of unity. The scars of the Hussite Wars lingered with Catholic and Utraquist factions still distrustful of one another. The powerful nobility had grown accustomed to influencing and often undermining the monarchy. Podobrady's reign had brought a degree of stability, but it was also marred by his excommunication and branding as a heretic by Rome. When he died, the question of succession became more than a matter of lineage. It was a struggle for the soul of Bohemia. Into this vacuum stepped Vladislav, selected by Bohemian nobles, not for his strength or assertiveness, but precisely for his pliability. He was seen as a compromise candidate, a foreign royal with prestigious bloodlines yet young and untested. His election in 1485 was less a coronation than a strategic arrangement among competing factions. He was crowned as King of Bohemia under the understanding that real power would remain dispersed among the aristocracy. This set the tone for Vladislav's early rule. Unlike his predecessors, he lacked both the charisma of Podobrady and the ruthless efficiency of external rivals such as Matthias Corvinus of Hungary. Vladislav's court became a theater of negotiation, where every decree required noble consensus and every policy was subject to noble reinterpretation. The Jagiellonian style of rule, traditionally cautious and consensus-based, clashed with the fractious and opportunistic political landscape of Bohemia. From the outset, Vladislav exhibited a temperament ill-suited for confrontation. He preferred appeasement to assertion and delegated sensitive tasks to advisors who often had their own agendas. Even ceremonial decisions were bogged down in indecision. Nobles sensing weakness began carving out greater domains of influence, forming regional leagues and enforcing their own codes of justice. Royal authority diminished not through rebellion, but through erosion. This became especially clear in the crown's dealings with the church. While Vladislav attempted to maintain a delicate balance between Catholic orthodoxy and Utraquist demands, he often delayed or avoided definitive positions. In practice, this allowed each faction to strengthen its hand independently. The papacy grew increasingly skeptical of Vladislav's will to enforce Catholic doctrine, while moderate Utraquists viewed him as a distant and disinterested sovereign. Religious appointments, particularly bishoprics, became political chess pieces bartered among aristocrats and foreign envoys. Meanwhile, Matthias Corvinus loomed to the south. The Hungarian king had long coveted Bohemian lands and positioned himself as a defender of Catholicism against the heretic King Podobrady. Though Matthias had failed to prevent Vladislav's election, he did not relinquish his claims. Instead, in 1487, he invaded parts of Moravia and Silesia, capturing key towns and installing parallel administrations loyal to his crown. These territories, though nominally part of Bohemia, remained under Hungarian control for the rest of Vladislav's Bohemian reign. The irony was stark. While Vladislav held the title of King of Bohemia, substantial parts of his kingdom were ruled by another king. This dual sovereignty exacerbated the kingdom's fragmentation. Some nobles began to collaborate with Matthias, believing he could offer greater stability, or simply to hedge their political bets. Others exploited the division to assert regional autonomy, secure in the knowledge that no single power could challenge them comprehensively. Rather than mobilizing a decisive response, Vladislav opted for diplomacy. He dispatched envoys to Buda, offered symbolic concessions, and at times even entertained proposals of joint rule. His correspondence with Matthias reveals a tone of deference and occasional desperation, a young king hoping to delay conflict through personal appeals and shared interests. Yet, Matthias, ever the opportunist, continued to press his advantage. By 1490, the Bohemian crown was nominally held by Vladislav, but territorially divided. Moravia and Silesia were effectively under Hungarian governance. Bohemia proper was ruled through aristocratic coalitions, and royal revenues had dwindled to a fraction of what they had been under Podobrady. The royal palace in Prague became a symbol of diminished authority, impressive in architecture but hollow in influence. And yet Vladislav persisted. Whether out of a sense of duty inertia or a belief in dynastic destiny, he did not abdicate or flee. Instead, he adapted. He began appointing trusted advisors, often from foreign or lesser noble backgrounds, who were loyal not to the estates, but to the crown. This alienated the old nobility further, but gave Vladislav a fragile mechanism of control. These advisors in turn became intermediaries between the crown and the factionalized estates, navigating an increasingly complex political terrain. At court, formality replaced authority. Lavish ceremonies, marriage alliances, and religious festivals filled the calendar, projecting a semblance of royal grandeur. Behind the scenes, however, real decisions were made in private estates and foreign embassies. Vladislav's kingship became performative, a monarchy maintained by optics rather than enforcement. Still, the longer he remained in place, the more he became a fixture of the kingdom's stability, not because of strength, but because all alternatives appeared worse. His continued presence offered continuity in a time when any decisive change risked civil war or foreign intervention. In that paradox, Vladislav found his strange kind of power. He reigned not by commanding loyalty, but by being just acceptable enough to enough people. Yet this precarious balance would not hold indefinitely. The death of Matthias Corvinus in 1490 would radically alter Central Europe's power dynamics and set Vladislav on a path toward even deeper entanglement, first with the Hungarian crown and eventually with the Habsburgs. His rule in Bohemia, fragile as it was, would now intersect with a second throne and an even more unstable realm. The death of Matthias Corvinus in 1490 sent tremors across Central Europe. The once formidable Hungarian king had ruled not only Hungary, but held de facto control over large swaths of Moravia, Silesia, and Lusatia lands that were technically part of the Bohemian crown. With his sudden passing, these territories became contested ground once more, and a political vacuum opened at the heart of the region. Vladislav II, long overshadowed by Matthias, now stood before a critical choice to assert himself or be swept aside. What followed was a carefully orchestrated political campaign. Vladislav, though not known for aggressive action, recognized the opportunity. His claim to the Hungarian throne was not simply ambition, it was grounded in familial legitimacy. His mother was a Hungarian princess, and the Jagiellonian dynasty had growing prestige across Eastern Europe. But claims alone would not secure the crown. Hungary's nobility, fragmented and accustomed to Matthias's central authority, now sought a king they could manage. And Vladislav, with his reputation for conciliation and deference, seemed ideal. In 1491, Vladislav was elected King of Hungary at the Diet of Rakos. It was a decision driven more by noble self-interest than loyalty to the Jagiellonian cause. The Hungarian elite believed they were selecting a monarch who would not interfere with their autonomy, someone they could manipulate to preserve their privileges. For Vladislav, it was the culmination of years of quiet maneuvering alliances and the implicit promise that he would not become another Matthias. But the dual monarchy of Bohemia and Hungary came with severe complications. First was geography. Governing two separate kingdoms, each with distinct languages, customs, and political structures, placed immense strain on any sovereign. Vladislav spent much of his reign shuttling between Buda and Prague, while simultaneously managing conflicts in Croatia, Slavonia, and Transylvania regions that bristled under encroaching Ottoman pressure. Second was the issue of legitimacy. While Vladislav was crowned King of Hungary, the Habsburgs also asserted their claim through Archduke Maximilian of Austria. Though initially diffused through the Peace of Pressburg in 1491, the rivalry never vanished. The agreement ceded Matthias's conquest in Austria to the Habsburgs, and crucially included a succession clause if Vladislav died without a male heir. Hungary and Bohemia would pass to the Habsburg line. This clause, while seemingly distant, would one day determine the fate of both kingdoms. In the short term, Vladislav's ascension brought a semblance of peace. Hungarian nobles welcomed a pliable king, while Bohemia saw a renewed dynastic prestige. Yet beneath the surface, contradictions multiplied. To secure support, Vladislav had promised sweeping concessions, land grants, noble immunities, tax exemptions. These promises became law through the tripartitum, a semi-codified noble charter that effectively undermined royal authority in Hungary. It bound the king to the decisions of the Diet and restricted his ability to impose new taxes or raise armies independently. In other words, Vladislav wore two crowns, but wielded little real power in either. His reliance on noble factions to maintain his dual monarchy meant that court politics became increasingly factional. In Hungary, powerful magnates like the Bathory and Zapolia families emerged as regional warlords. In Bohemia, aristocrats continued to rule through local assemblies largely independent of the royal court. This fragmentation would have long-lasting consequences. Moreover, the Ottoman threat loomed larger. Under Sultan Bayezid II, the Ottomans pushed deeper into Hungary's southern frontiers. Fortress towns such as Jajce and Smederevo were under constant siege. Vladislav, constrained by his limited finances and noble resistance to central levies, could do little more than authorize regional commanders to negotiate truces or hire mercenaries. These defensive measures were often localized and reactive, lacking a coordinated royal strategy. Some commanders sought foreign aid, others made private arrangements with Ottoman beys. At court, Vladislav's attempts to maintain balance among competing factions required constant negotiation. Marriage diplomacy became one of his primary tools. His own marriage to Beatrice of Naples, the widow of Matthias Corvinus, was less about love than legitimacy. The union meant to appease Matthias's former supporters soon became a source of tension. Beatrice expected influence at court. Vladislav, however, sidelined her. Their relationship deteriorated, and in time he sought papal annulment. This episode alienated Neapolitan allies and exposed divisions within the royal household. More significantly, Vladislav's second marriage to Anne of Foix-Candale was a calculated move to strengthen ties with the French crown and secure a male heir. Their son Louis, born in 1504, would inherit both crowns at just 10 years old. But the boy's frailty and the political terms surrounding his future reign would only complicate succession. The Habsburg succession clause still loomed over the realm, and many nobles viewed young Louis as a temporary custodian rather than a source of renewed stability. As Vladislav aged, the strains of dual monarchy became more visible. He rarely issued decrees without noble approval, and his royal council often debated minor appointments for months. A chronic lack of funds led to arrears in court salaries, military upkeep, and infrastructure. Even royal castles began to fall into disrepair. His once grand coronation in Buda gave way to modest public appearances, often in borrowed robes or rented halls. Diplomats from Venice and Poland began to remark with faint derision on the beggar king of Central Europe. And yet Vladislav remained personally popular among many of his subjects. His mild demeanor, patience, and avoidance of bloodshed earned him the ironic nickname Vladislav Bene Vladislav the Benign. In a region exhausted by decades of war and upheaval, his cautious rule offered a kind of weary stability. He was not loved for his strength, but respected for his restraint. Still, this image concealed a growing crisis. His inability or unwillingness to centralize power meant that key decisions were increasingly dictated by the ambitions of regional strongmen. The growing strength of the Zapolias in eastern Hungary and the fragmentation of military command would soon paralyze efforts to resist Ottoman incursions. Vladislav's court, meanwhile, became a hotbed of backroom deals, succession intrigue, and subtle betrayals. As his reign moved into its final decade, paranoia began to take root not only within Vladislav himself, but in the system he had helped create. Royal advisors began vetting food more carefully, correspondence was triple-checked, and noble envoys whispered of plots real and imagined. Poison, both literal and political, would define the final act of Vladislav's reign. By the opening years of the 16th century, Vladislav II was a king in name, but a prisoner of his own court. The dual crowns of Bohemia and Hungary offered ceremonial prestige but not effective control. Real power had diffused across layers of aristocracy, regional assemblies, and personal retinues. The central state apparatus, such as it was, relied not on institutional stability, but on personal relationships and favors. Governance had become improvisational, a network of compromises rather than a command structure. Nowhere was this more evident than in Bohemia. The land diets gatherings of noble representatives had taken on the role of quasi-legislative bodies. They approved taxation, debated judicial matters, and even altered succession laws without royal initiation. Vladislav, aware of the balance he needed to maintain, rarely contested their authority. On the contrary, he often reinforced it, confirming noble privileges in exchange for political calm. But this came at a steep cost. Each confirmation of noble autonomy further reduced the crown's leverage. Estates refused military conscription unless their own interests were directly threatened. Revenue collection became inconsistent and corrupted. Royal towns, once direct agents of the king, increasingly fell under the sway of local lords. Even the Bohemian chancellery, the administrative office that issued royal decrees, began to insert language favorable to noble estates, sometimes without Vladislav's review. In Hungary, the situation was no better. The Diet's grip on the monarchy tightened with each passing year. Regional governors acted with near-total independence. The southern frontier facing the Ottoman menace became a loose confederation of noble-led military districts. The crown, technically supreme, was functionally irrelevant in frontier defense. Attempts to organize centralized responses were met with resistance or outright defiance. This fragmentation set the stage for court intrigue. As Vladislav's authority waned, his court attracted a new class of actors, minor nobles, foreign agents, and ambitious advisors who navigated power not through titles, but through influence. These figures recognized that true leverage came from proximity to the king, and they fought viciously to secure it. One such figure was George of Brandenburg-Ansbach, a distant cousin by marriage who rose to prominence in the early 1500s. George styled himself a reformer and confidant of the king, but his loyalties remained ambiguous. Some sources suggest he used his access to redirect crown revenues into personal ventures. Others claim he acted as an intermediary between Habsburg agents and dissatisfied Bohemian nobles. Regardless, his presence introduced an element of foreign interference into already unstable internal politics. The royal court in Buda became a hothouse of suspicions. Factions formed around the two queens. Beatrice, still present despite her annulment, and Anne of Foix-Condal, who bore Vladislav's only surviving son. Beatrice commanded respect among older Hungarian magnates. Anne, younger and better connected to France, became the patron of emerging noble families seeking favor. Their respective households became centers of informal diplomacy gossip, and in several rumored instances, poisoned hospitality. Food tasters became a permanent feature of the royal entourage. Tinctures and herbal infusions were administered to the king, daily not just for health, but as presumed counteragents to potential toxins. A suspicious number of court servants fell ill, including 2 scribes and a Hungarian chamberlain. While no formal accusations were ever made, whispers of poisoning spread beyond the palace and into diplomatic dispatches. The Venetian ambassador reported that the kitchens of Buda boil with more secrets than stew. These episodes deepened Vladislav's retreat from governance. Increasingly absent from daily affairs, he relied on councils and chancellors to handle matters of state. But delegation bred competition. Advisors accused each other of disloyalty, document forgeries became a tactic for discrediting rivals, and meetings of the royal council devolved into bitter personal disputes. One Polish observer remarked that the king's court is no longer a court but a market of schemes. Religious tensions added to the chaos. Though Vladislav had tried to maintain neutrality, the early spread of Lutheran ideas began to influence parts of Bohemia. Nobles and towns sympathetic to reformist teachings found space to operate under the increasingly distracted royal administration. Catholic clergy pressed for enforcement of orthodoxy, but Vladislav avoided confrontation. His silence allowed a quiet religious pluralism to take root, one that would soon erupt into open conflict during his son's reign. As the royal presence faded from both capitals, symbolic gestures replaced substantive governance. Vladislav issued charters reaffirming traditional rites, hosted ceremonial hunts, and celebrated public feast days. But behind the scenes, paranoia crept deeper. The king's personal chambers were guarded more heavily. Foreign envoys were subjected to meticulous vetting. Letters were routinely intercepted and copied. Some nobles began employing their own informants within the royal staff. This atmosphere of distrust was not unique to Vladislav's reign, but the king's temperament magnified it. His chronic indecision left space for others to act in his name. At least 3 different factions claimed to speak for royal will, at various times, one in Prague, one in Buda, and one consisting of courtiers who followed the king personally. Conflicting edicts were issued, land disputes multiplied, border garrisons received contradictory orders and often chose to follow whoever paid them first. Despite this, Vladislav refused to institute reforms. Proposals to streamline governance, standardize military command, or centralize taxation were debated but never enacted. Every faction feared that empowering the crown might come at their own expense. Thus, policies stagnated, while court intrigue flourished. The court's descent into dysfunction culminated in 1508, when a forged letter supposedly bearing Vladislav's seal ordered the transfer of southern frontier funds to a private noble army. The funds disappeared. The army never materialized. Investigation was inconclusive, but trust between royal officials and the nobility broke down further. More alarming was the fact that the seal had been replicated with alarming accuracy, suggesting an insider's access. Vladislav, aging and increasingly fatigued, responded with silence and avoidance. He summoned fewer councils, delayed more decrees, and left pressing decisions to chancellors who no longer coordinated. His once frequent progressions through royal towns dwindled. Nobles and foreign dignitaries seeking audiences were forced to wait weeks, sometimes months. The king was now a figure of rumor rather than command. Was he ill, senile, poisoned, or merely disengaged? Reports varied, but one pattern was clear: power had seeped out of his hands and into the margins of a system no longer centered on the crown. This creeping paralysis did not go unnoticed. The Habsburg court began preparing contingencies for succession. The Ottoman Empire, sensing strategic disarray, intensified its pressure on Hungarian territories. And within both Bohemia and Hungary, young nobles saw opportunity and chaos opportunity that would erupt into contest the moment Vladislav died. The final years of his reign would unfold not with grandeur or resolution, but with whispered betrayals, contested documents, and an ever-expanding shadow of dread. As Vladislav II's reign crossed into its twilight years, the most pressing issue became one he could no longer postpone: the succession. The Peace of Pressburg, signed back in 1491, contained a clause that now hovered over the throne like a loaded weapon. If Vladislav died without a legitimate male heir, the crowns of Hungary and Bohemia would pass to the Habsburgs. This was not just a legal technicality. It was a geopolitical tripwire primed to redraw the map of Central Europe. For years, this clause had been a theoretical concern, but after decades of childless marriage and failed alliances, Vladislav's second wife, Anne of Foix-Condal, gave birth to a son in 1504, Louis. The long-awaited heir was not simply a dynastic victory. His existence postponed for a time the Habsburg claim and offered the possibility of continued Jagiellonian rule across two thrones. Yet the boy's arrival only deepened court instability. Anne of Foix-Condal died soon after childbirth, likely due to complications. The sudden death of the queen removed one of the few stabilizing influences within Vladislav's inner circle. With her gone, the young Louis became the object of intense political maneuvering. Factions coalesced around the child, each hoping to control his future regency and influence his eventual policies. Vladislav, aging and increasingly disconnected, was incapable of managing these ambitions. The problem was further complicated by Louis's frailty. Even as a child, he was described as weak of constitution, frequently ill, and uninterested in martial training. Some nobles began to doubt whether he would even live to reach adulthood. Others, more cynical, began positioning themselves for a post-Jagiellonian future, quietly reopening correspondence with the Habsburgs. Meanwhile, the geopolitical balance outside Vladislav's courts was shifting. The Ottoman Empire had entered a new phase of expansion under Sultan Selim II. While the Eastern Front had once been dominated by occasional raids and border skirmishes, the Ottomans now employed a policy of systematic encroachment. Hungarian fortresses in the south, such as Belgrade and Szabadka, reported increasing pressure not just from raiders, but from organized siege forces. In response, Vladislav attempted to coordinate defensive measures. He authorized new levies called diets to approve military funding and empowered nobles along the southern frontier to act with discretion. But the effort fell apart under the weight of internal division. Hungarian magnates disagreed on strategy. Some demanded more centralized control, others insisted on local autonomy. The diets stalled and no unified army was ever raised. One especially damaging development came in 1511 when a coalition of southern lords requested direct assistance from the Holy Roman Empire, bypassing Vladislav entirely. Though the request was framed as a plea for aid, it was a direct signal confidence in the king's ability to defend his realms had eroded. In practice, Habsburg agents began organizing support missions that doubled as intelligence operations, mapping frontier strongholds, assessing loyalty among Hungarian commanders, and identifying potential allies for a post-Vladislav succession. At the same time, Bohemia's political climate deteriorated in parallel. The kingdom had largely been at peace, but under the surface, rival religious currents stirred. Utraquists, a moderate Hussite faction, sought to expand their rights and church appointments. Catholic clergy backed by Rome and some Austrian prelates pushed for tighter orthodoxy. Vladislav, true to form, issued vague edicts aimed at appeasing both sides, but these only encouraged further polarization. Within Prague's elite circles, fears grew that upon Vladislav's death, religious tensions might spill into open confrontation. Noble families began reinforcing their private estates and forming military retinues for ceremonial purposes. Armories expanded. Mercenaries appeared along trade routes, recruited under the guise of estate security. The veneer of peace began to crack. Even within Vladislav's court, the tone shifted. His once careful neutrality in religious matters became a liability. Both factions now accused him of favoring the other. Some clerics refused to attend court masses. Nobles introduced whispered petitions demanding that Vladislav declare for one side or another. He did neither. Instead, he retreated further into ceremonial routine. Physically, the king's health had begun to decline. Reports mention episodes of shortness of breath, tremors in the hands, and extended periods of inactivity. He grew thinner. His appetite diminished. There is some evidence from French and Venetian sources that his advisors began limiting his exposure to external audiences, either to conceal his condition or to control messaging. The issue of poison resurfaced. Several trusted physicians were dismissed without public explanation. Court gossip circulated that one had been caught administering questionable tinctures to the king. Another died suddenly, prompting rumors of retaliatory murder. No formal investigation followed, but the atmosphere of suspicion worsened. Vladislav's meals were now prepared under direct supervision, and the roster of his kitchen staff changed weekly. Visitors to the royal chambers were monitored, and some were required to drink from the same goblets as the king before being admitted. Still, Vladislav maintained a semblance of order. He attended council meetings when able signed decrees, and made occasional public appearances, often during religious festivals or state ceremonies. But these were brief and carefully choreographed. Behind the scenes, power shifted steadily toward two nodes, the Habsburg diplomatic corps and a circle of Hungarian magnates, led by the increasingly assertive John Zapolya. Zapolya, scion of a powerful noble family, had long been active along the southern front. By 1513, he emerged as the de facto military commander of much of eastern Hungary. His troops were loyal to him personally, not the crown. His letters to Vladislav remained respectful, but his actions suggested independence. The king, too, weakened to challenge Zapolya, allowed it, if reluctantly. This created a dangerous triangle of succession prospects, the frail boy Louis backed by a few loyal nobles and royalists, Zapolya with his military base and regional dominance, and the Habsburgs waiting in the wings with legal claim and growing diplomatic penetration. Vladislav, seated at the center of this triangle, had neither the will nor the strength to break the impasse. And so, as his health declined and his court ossified, Vladislav watched his realm drift toward fragmentation. He had once worn 2 crowns. Now he presided over 2 powder kegs, each armed, each suspicious, and each already calculating what would follow the death of their aging king. By the time Vladislav II entered the final years of his reign, the illusion of centralized rule had largely collapsed. Both in Hungary and Bohemia, the monarchy had become a symbolic presence, a legitimizing backdrop for aristocratic maneuvering, foreign interference, and regional self-interest. But what remained dangerous was not just the king's weakness. It was the growing unpredictability of the political actors surrounding him, all vying for a post-Vladislav world, all unwilling to share power and none in a position to guarantee continuity. The Ottoman Empire, sensing this disintegration, shifted from probing raids to strategic annexation. The loss of Belgrade in 1515 was particularly devastating. The city, once a bulwark of Christian defense, fell after a relatively short siege. Hungarian reinforcements were disorganized and late. No royal army came to relieve the garrison. For many, this defeat marked the beginning of the end. It signaled that Hungary, long the buffer zone between east and west, could no longer secure its own borders. Vladislav's response was characteristically passive. He issued proclamations praising the defenders of Belgrade and called for pan-European unity against the Ottomans. But no new troops were raised, no reforms introduced. His treasury was depleted, and the Hungarian Diet refused additional taxation without sweeping concessions. These he would not or could not deliver. The loss of Belgrade echoed throughout Christian Europe. The Pope issued appeals. Polish envoys offered condolences. The Habsburgs offered aid at a price. But within Hungary itself, trust in royal command had evaporated. As royal power receded, ambitious magnates began operating like kings in miniature. John Zapolya fortified Transylvania. Other nobles established quasi-independent militias in Upper Hungary and along the Croatian frontier. Bohemia's nobility, while less militarized, grew increasingly assertive in matters of law commerce and ecclesiastical appointment. Vladislav became less a king than a procedural rubber stamp, expected to approve whatever came across his desk, if he was even coherent enough to read it. Inside the royal court, daily life took on a surreal quality. Rumors of espionage, secret alliances, and assassination attempts abounded. Several cooks and servants were arrested and interrogated in 1516, accused of conspiring to sicken the king. Their confessions extracted under duress implicated no clear ringleader, but heightened a sense of looming crisis. Vladislav's meals were limited to a small selection of dishes, personally inspected by his closest advisors. Even water was drawn from a separate well known only to the kitchen overseer. There is no direct evidence that Vladislav was ever poisoned, but what is clear is that his physical and mental condition deteriorated rapidly during this period. He suffered from chronic fatigue, irregular breathing, and intermittent confusion. Observers reported episodes in which he failed to recognize high-ranking courtiers or forgot the content of recent decrees. At times he appeared lucid, even authoritative, only to lapse into silence or apparent disorientation mid-conversation. This erratic behavior created space for manipulation. Nobles and advisors began forging documents backdating charters or claiming royal approval retroactively. In one notorious case, a land grant in Slovakia was contested by two families both producing near-identical decrees, each with the king's seal dated within days of each other. The royal chancellery launched an internal investigation, but no punishment was ever handed down. The king, when asked to clarify which decree was authentic, replied, "I cannot recall." Foreign ambassadors, especially those from the Holy Roman Empire and Venice, began bypassing Vladislav, entirely communicating instead with factions they considered more reliable. This was not hidden. Reports from 1517 describe envoys meeting with Hungarian and Bohemian lords without requesting a royal audience. In Buda, the Viennese delegation was said to have rented an entire manor, effectively turning it into a shadow consulate for Habsburg interests. Court records show no protest from the crown. And yet Vladislav remained seated on his throne. He continued to attend public functions, albeit sparingly. When the Hungarian Diet met, he was often present in body, if not in mind. Portraits painted during this period show a gaunt, distant-looking figure, eyes hollowed by fatigue, his robes hanging loose on a frame, visibly diminished. When he spoke, he did so in short phrases usually prepared by his secretaries. Once known for his affability, he now greeted even close advisors with formal stiffness, as if unsure who they were or what role they played. At the margins of this decline, power coalesced into more dangerous shapes. John Zapolya's influence expanded, and by 1518 he controlled nearly all of eastern Hungary, including several strategic fortresses. His correspondence with foreign courts intensified. Some in Buda whispered that he had already prepared a coronation outfit should the king die suddenly. Meanwhile, the Habsburg court grew bolder. Archduke Ferdinand, nephew to Emperor Maximilian, began referring to Louis Vladislav's son as our future ward. Treaties were drafted, contingencies laid. Plans were made for the boy to be married into the Habsburg line, and if necessary to be removed from Hungary for education and safety. These were not proposals. They were projections of intent. For Vladislav, the reality must have been evident even through the fog of illness and distrust. He had preserved the union of crowns, but not their cohesion. He had outlived his rivals, but not their legacies. Matthias Corvinus had taken Bohemia by force. Vladislav had reclaimed it diplomatically, only to govern it weakly. Now at the edge of death, he watched as two empires positioned themselves to inherit what he had failed to unify. Toward the end of 1518, Vladislav ceased attending council altogether. Dispatches from the royal household noted that he remained in bed for days, rising only for prayer and meals. Visitors were turned away. The royal guard doubled its presence around his chambers. One final decree authorizing the Regency Council for young Louis bore a visibly trembling signature. In the early months of 1519, messengers were seen departing Buda and Prague at unusual hours bearing sealed letters marked with the royal crest. Their destination, Vienna. As 1519 dawned, Vladislav II's reign had become a shadow of what it once promised. The man once crowned king of two nations now spent most of his days bedridden in Buda Castle, surrounded by a rotating staff of cautious courtiers, skeptical physicians, and silent attendants. Reports from the royal household describe a man frail in body and increasingly detached in spirit, yet still haunted by the implications of every sealed letter, every hushed conversation outside his chamber door. The kingdom did not wait for his death, it moved ahead without him. In Hungary, John Zapolya continued to act with virtual autonomy, ruling the eastern regions like a vassalless prince. His correspondence with Poland and the Ottoman frontier had taken on a bolder tone with references to securing the realm during interregnum. Though never stated outright, his ambition was plain to all observers. Zapolya intended to seize the throne once Vladislav died by force if necessary. The regency for Prince Louis, meanwhile, became a contest of influence. Though the boy was officially under the guardianship of a royal council formed by senior nobles from both Bohemia and Hungary, each faction interpreted this guardianship differently. The Hungarian magnates sought to control the regency through proximity and personal loyalty. The Bohemians, who saw Louis more as a symbol than a ruler, wanted the regency to remain decentralized, ensuring their autonomy in perpetuity. And looming over both camps were the Habsburgs. Archduke Ferdinand, sensing his moment, increased his diplomatic presence in both Prague and Buda. Habsburg envoys offered bribes, drafted treaties, and circulated genealogical pamphlets affirming Ferdinand's bloodline connection to Louis. Behind closed doors, they also issued warnings. If chaos followed Vladislav's death, the Holy Roman Empire would intervene, and not necessarily on the side of the Jagiellonian heir. In this atmosphere of rising tension, suspicion returned to the royal court in a more dangerous form. In February of 1519, a senior courtier fell violently ill after drinking from a ceremonial cup intended for the king. The man survived, but barely. Physicians suspected poison. An investigation ensued, and though no perpetrator was found, the implications were clear. Someone had tried and possibly failed to murder Vladislav or one of his advisors. Whether it was a genuine attempt or a staged message is unknown, but the consequences were immediate. Audiences were halted. Food was tested in triplicate, and all correspondence was now intercepted by a team of secretaries, handpicked by the king's chamberlain. Paranoia seeped through every corridor of the palace. The king's private scribes began copying his signatures onto blank vellum, a contingency some believed to issue decrees in the event of sudden death or incoherence. Multiple decrees were later found with similar handwriting, but vastly different intents. One granted lands to a Bohemian noble loyal to Prague. Another stripped a Hungarian fortress from a Zapolya ally. Both bore the same seal. Whether Vladislav authorized either is uncertain. What is certain is that his name was still being wielded like a weapon, even when his will to rule had all but vanished. As the spring of 1519 approached, signs of imminent decline became impossible to ignore. Eyewitness accounts described the king as emaciated, barely able to rise from his bed without assistance. He had stopped eating full meals, consuming only broth or wine. He sometimes mistook visiting nobles for old enemies, or spoke in incomplete sentences, drifting in and out of lucidity. The papal nuncio, after a brief and disturbing audience, wrote to Rome, "The soul remains, but the flesh has retired. He is no longer of this court, though he has not yet passed." Behind closed doors, the royal council debated succession with increasing urgency. One group favoring continuity pushed for young Louis to be crowned immediately upon Vladislav's death, to prevent Zapolya from claiming the throne by force. Another group argued that Louis should be relocated to Vienna for his safety and education, in effect placing him under Habsburg custody. The divisions were so stark that they risked sparking a civil conflict before the king had even died. It was in this context, fractured, paranoid, and adrift, that Vladislav's final days unfolded. There was no grand farewell, no public statement, no ceremony of abdication. In late February or early March, sources differ on the exact date the king ceased responding to external stimuli. He lay in bed, eyes open but unfocused, whispering to himself in Polish and Latin, alternating between fragments of prayer and names of long-dead relatives. A priest was called. Last rites were administered in private. And then quietly the monarch who had worn 2 crowns, governed neither with strength, and endured longer than most expected, died. The court did not announce his passing for 2 full days. During that time, guards were posted at all exits. Messengers were detained. Counselors met in secret to finalize letters to Prague and Vienna. Only once these letters had left did the court issue a public notice: Vladislav II, King of Bohemia and Hungary, was dead. The reaction was swift and not uniformly mournful. In Buda, mourning processions were held, but many nobles remained in their estates awaiting news of what would follow. In Prague, the land diet assembled within days, not to grieve, but to assert the integrity of Bohemian law in the succession crisis to come. In Vienna, Ferdinand convened a session with his advisors and began preparations to safeguard the succession. In Transylvania, Zapolia gathered his troops and awaited the coronation of the boy king Louis. There was no time for reflection. Vladislav's death was not an ending, but a trigger. Within weeks, Bohemia and Hungary would be pulled into a vortex of contest invasion and eventual war. But for a brief moment, just a single breath in European history, the old king lay still in his castle, surrounded by quiet. His legacy undecided, his realm on the edge. Vladislav II's death in early 1516 marked the quiet end of a reign, defined more by avoidance than by action. But if his rule had been a slow erosion of royal authority, his death acted like a hammer blow to the already fragile political architecture of Central Europe. What remained was a 10-year-old boy, Louis II, now king of both Hungary and Bohemia, but incapable of ruling either. And around him, 3 competing forces quickly formed the Bohemian estates: the Hungarian nobility led by John Zapolia, and the increasingly assertive Habsburgs. In Bohemia, the reaction was swift and institutional. The land diet in Prague convened immediately, ostensibly to affirm Louis's kingship, but in reality it seized the opportunity to further curtail royal prerogatives. The estates reaffirmed their exclusive control over taxation appointments and lawmaking. The Regency Council created for Louis was nominal, acting more as a liaison between regional power blocks than a governing body. While they continued to recognize Louis as king, they ruled independently in practice. Hungary's response, however, descended into factionalism. John Zapolia, voivode of Transylvania and commander of the largest standing force in the region, wasted no time consolidating power. Though he publicly acknowledged Louis's kingship, he presented himself as the guardian of the realm, issuing decrees and receiving foreign envoys without consulting the royal council. Zapolia's hold over eastern Hungary became so firm that some towns began minting coins bearing his emblem alongside the royal crest. Meanwhile, the Habsburgs, particularly Archduke Ferdinand of Austria, made their long-anticipated move. Backed by the 1506 succession agreements and the 1515 First Congress of Vienna, where Vladislav had pledged his son's marriage into the Habsburg line, Ferdinand claimed the right to act as Louis's protector. He began sending troops into western Hungary ostensibly to defend against the Ottomans, but clearly to counterbalance Zapolia. The result was a tense 3-way standoff. Zapolia controlled the east and the military apparatus. Ferdinand controlled the west and had diplomatic leverage. The Bohemian estates controlled the north and held legal continuity. And in the middle sat Louis, a child with a crown moved between castles under guard, used as a political prop rather than a monarch. The Ottomans, watching from across the Danube, took careful note. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, the empire had grown increasingly bold in its incursions into the Balkans. Reports of internal chaos in Hungary, feuding nobles, rival diets, and weak royal authority were exactly the kind of conditions Suleiman had exploited in other borderlands. Plans began to take shape in Constantinople for a more aggressive push into Central Europe. Back in Hungary, the regency broke down almost immediately. The royal council intended to guide Louis until his majority was split between pro-Zapolia and pro-Habsburg factions. Each side issued contradictory orders. Frontier commanders were left unsure of who to obey. Several garrisons acted autonomously, negotiating their own defense pacts or refusing orders altogether. In 1517, the situation worsened when rumors spread that Ferdinand intended to remove Louis from Hungary entirely and raise him in Vienna. Zapolia, furious, declared that any such action would constitute an act of treason. His men began patrolling roads between Buda and Austria, intercepting couriers and arresting travelers suspected of carrying Habsburg letters. Skirmishes followed. Blood was shed, though open war had not yet begun. Meanwhile, the regency began collapsing under the weight of its own duplicity. In Bohemia, the Diet refused to send funds to support Louis's court, citing irregularities in royal bookkeeping. In Hungary, competing regents began forging decrees, each claiming to speak in Louis's name. One such decree ordered the transfer of a fortress to Zapolia's allies. Another revoked the same grant 3 days later, citing a clerical error. Both bore the royal seal. By 1518, foreign powers viewed Hungary not as a kingdom, but as a collapsing buffer zone. Venetian diplomats described it as a land of crowns without command. Papal emissaries, once hopeful about a unified Christian defense against the Ottomans, now lobbied more aggressively for Habsburg intervention, arguing that only imperial order could salvage the region. But the boy king remained. Despite his frailty and occasional illness, Louis was paraded through cities featured in religious processions and placed ceremonially at the head of royal audiences. Behind the scenes, however, the court sheltered him from almost all real decision-making. His education was inconsistent, managed by tutors loyal to different factions. He spoke several languages, Latin, Hungarian, some German, but understood little of the chaos surrounding him. The symbolic nature of his rule was starkest in 1519, when Ferdinand was elected Holy Roman Emperor, succeeding his brother Maximilian. With imperial resources now at his disposal, Ferdinand declared his intention to enforce the succession treaties signed with Vladislav II. This announcement was in effect a declaration of superiority over Louis's fragile regency. Zapolia, unwilling to accept imperial overlordship, began assembling an army. At the same time, Suleiman finalized preparations for a full-scale invasion of Hungary. Reports indicate that Ottoman spies were embedded in both Zapolia's and Ferdinand's courts, feeding intelligence about troop movements, alliances, and supply routes. The stage was now set, an exhausted, fragmented kingdom, led by a child flanked by two rival protectors, and targeted by a disciplined empire to the south. Louis, still only 13, was informed that he would soon lead his army against the Ottomans. The decision made by the council was less about strategy and more about optics, an attempt to rally the fractured nobility around a monarch in time of war. But as preparations began, it became painfully clear that Vladislav's legacy was not a kingdom ready for war, but a realm teetering on the edge of disintegration. The final chapter in the long unraveling of Vladislav II's legacy arrived in 1526 on a blood-soaked plain near the Hungarian town of Mohacs. It was there on August 29th that the combined effects of decades of administrative decay, aristocratic defiance, and strategic passivity came to a catastrophic conclusion. The Battle of Mohacs would become one of the most defining and devastating moments in Hungarian history, and it would close the curtain on the Jagiellonian experiment in Central Europe. Louis II, now just 20 years old, had reigned for a decade without truly ruling. Though crowned king of Hungary and Bohemia, his minority had been dominated by rival regents, contested decrees, and fragmented loyalties. His marriage to Mary of Austria, Ferdinand's sister, had momentarily stabilized the diplomatic front, but done little to repair the institutional fractures within the kingdom. Louis remained a constitutional monarch in form, but a passive observer in practice. What brought him to the battlefield in 1526 was not a carefully prepared defense of Christian Europe, but a desperate gamble. The Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent had launched a massive invasion into Hungarian territory earlier that summer. With a force of perhaps 60,000 to 100,000 men, including elite janissaries, heavy artillery, and experienced cavalry, Suleiman advanced with speed and precision. He crossed the Danube in July, encountering little resistance. Fortresses that should have delayed him fell quickly or offered no resistance at all. Hungary's response was characteristically disjointed. The nobility, fractured and distrustful, delayed assembling a royal army. Some feared that marching under Louis would empower the crown. Others suspected Habsburg manipulation. Funds for troops and supplies were approved only at the last minute. Louis's force was composed of about 25,000 to 30,000 men, a mix of royal guards, mercenaries, and noble contingents with little coordination or shared command structure. Despite his inexperience and physical frailty, Louis insisted on taking the field. Contemporary accounts suggest he was earnest, even brave, in the days leading to the battle. He believed, perhaps naively, that his presence would inspire unity and that God would favor the Christian cause. But few around him believed they could win. The terrain was unfavorable, the troops exhausted, and morale uneven. Several commanders warned Louis to retreat and regroup. He refused. On the morning of August 29th, under heavy clouds and oppressive heat, the two forces met at Mohacs. The Hungarian army, poorly positioned and lacking cohesion, was quickly overwhelmed. Ottoman artillery and cavalry tore through the flanks. The royal infantry was routed within 2 hours. Panic spread. Some nobles fled the battlefield, others died fighting. The king's personal bodyguard attempted a last-ditch defense, but it was hopeless. Louis II was believed to have fled the field on horseback during the collapse. As he crossed a marshy area near the river, Sile, either in retreat or seeking to regroup, his horse lost footing. The king, weighed down by armor, was thrown into the mud. He drowned not by sword or arrow, but by the weight of the very symbols of his kingship. His body was discovered days later, unmarked by battle, face down in the marsh. The Battle of Mohacs was more than a military defeat. It was the obliteration of the Hungarian state as it had existed. An estimated 14,000 to 16,000 troops were killed. Nearly the entire political elite of southern Hungary perished. Key bishops, generals, and nobles, those who had governed, quarreled, and delayed for decades, were wiped out in a single afternoon. In the aftermath, the power vacuum opened even wider. Zápolya, who had not participated in the battle, declared himself king with the backing of a faction of Hungarian nobles. Ferdinand of Habsburg, invoking both family ties and the succession treaties, also claimed the crown. Civil war erupted. Hungary was now split 3 ways. Royal Hungary under Habsburg controlled Ottoman-occupied Central Hungary, and the Eastern territories under Zápolya's nominal rule. Bohemia, though untouched by the Ottomans, faced its own succession crisis. Ferdinand was swiftly elected king there as well, but only after intense negotiation and with major concessions to the estates. The Bohemian nobility had little love for imperial centralization, but even less for another prolonged interregnum. The election sealed Habsburg dominance over the region, a dominance that would last nearly 4 centuries. Vladislav II's long, cautious, and often ineffective reign had planted the seeds of this disaster. His preference for compromise over reform, for symbolism over substance, had preserved peace in the short term, but hollowed out royal authority in both kingdoms. His failure to build institutions capable of resisting external invasion or internal fragmentation left his son surrounded by title but bereft of power. When the test came, there was nothing left to hold the kingdom together. Mohacs was not the end of Hungary, but it was the end of a certain kind of Hungary, one led by native kings, ruled through negotiated consensus, and situated at the fault line between Latin Christendom and the Islamic East. What followed was occupation division and the long Habsburg administration of decline and resistance. And it all ended where it had begun, in a marsh, with a king drowned in his armor, abandoned by the very structures he had inherited, but never learned to command. The life and death of Vladislav II and the catastrophic unraveling of his legacy offer a stark lesson in the dangers of passive rulership during moments of geopolitical upheaval. His reign, spanning over 4 decades, was not one of tyranny or war, but of inaction, appeasement, and chronic decentralization. In both Bohemia and Hungary, Vladislav allowed the nobility to entrench themselves at the expense of crown authority. He avoided reforms that could have strengthened state institutions, opting instead for short-term stability over long-term resilience. At the time, these choices may have seemed prudent. After the turbulence of the Hussite Wars and the aggressive campaigns of Matthias Corvinus, Vladislav's gentler rule provided a kind of political respite. But that calm was deceptive. Beneath it, royal administration withered, foreign threats grew bolder, and domestic elites lost any sense of shared responsibility for the survival of the state. Vladislav became a figurehead, respected, even liked, but never feared nor followed. The result was a fragmented realm left vulnerable to both internal contest and external conquest. His son Louis II inherited a crown without an army, a court without coherence, and a kingdom unable to respond to its greatest crisis. The Battle of Mohacs, in which Louis died and Hungary fell into chaos, was not an isolated catastrophe. It was the logical conclusion of decades of drift. In the broader sweep of European history, Vladislav II's reign marks the final moment before Central Europe was irreversibly reshaped by the Habsburg-Ottoman struggle. It was the last breath of a medieval monarchy overwhelmed by modern empires. His final days, filled with poison, paranoia, and paralysis, were not just personal, they mirrored the fate of his kingdoms.